this saber rattling by Trump will be welcomed by some. But the fact is, Trump is not going to occupy Iran. He's not going to try and rule Iran. He might try some kind of decapitation, quick in, quick out operation. But as with Venezuela, that may not change the regime at all.
At least 12 people have been killed in clashes between protesters and security forces that broke out in Iran last week. Demonstrations, which have now entered their 9th day, started over the rise in the cost of living. Merchants of Tehran's Grand Bazaar closed their shops amid a currency crisis, stating it was no longer economical to keep trading. So how serious is this? Let's speak to Professor of Iranian History, Ali Ansari. I really want to get my head around how seriously to take this. Is this different from previous demonstrations? We've seen them before. What should our expectation be about the future for the Iranian regime, given the protests?
Thank you. I mean, I think these are just the latest in the continuation of protests that have been building up really for the past few years. So it's another nail in the coffin of the regime, if you will, in large part because they don't really have any answers to the fundamental underlying problems facing the country. And every time they face a protest, they find themselves with much more limited options. So I think the way to look at these protests is not to see them as going, as able to sort of like transform the situation in themselves, but they can trigger all sorts of other events that may lead to sort of a cascade of sort of problems for the regime, which will ultimately be its undoing. And this has always been the problem. The problem is the regime faces, every time a protest arises, it has less options, it has less means of dealing with it. And of course, the risk of something really getting out of control is even greater. So if they wanted to maintain control of the economy, this is not the way to do it.
So
ultimately, this is going to weaken it.
It's been said to me that, previously a lot of demonstrations have been more cultural. They've been about liberalisation. They've been focused on young people, maybe more highly educated people. This is more serious because it comes from the bazaar. It's about economic conditions. And economic conditions drive a wholly different class of people out onto the streets and a wholly different sort of base of support. Do you think that's not right, actually?
Well, I mean, insofar as we had we had very, very severe protests in 2017 and 2019 as well. And these were largely driven also by the economy. And certainly those in 2019, were resembled what you're seeing today, a little bit more in terms of both the economic catalyst, but also being much broader, often in parts of the country that actually nobody in Tehran knows exists, pretty violent too. And I think this is what you're seeing again. In this case, obviously, the circumstances have changed again. I mean, the economy is in a much worse situation. International tensions are extremely high. The government itself and the regime itself is, again, has much more limited options. In fact, after the Women, Life, Freedom protests back in 2022, there was a sort of a commentary in government circles basically saying that for the first time they were running out of sort of options of how to deal with things, and that the only option left to them was to use a big stick, essentially to repress and to crack down. Previously, they'd often offered a few sort of breads and circuses and this sort of thing to keep people happy. This time they don't have that.
How seriously should we take this apparent idea that Ayatollah Khamenei would actually flee because his forces would fail to suppress protests, or they might desert? How likely is that?
I think there's a little bit of sort of grey propaganda going on there in terms of things being leaked into the media to sort of encourage a view. I'm not sure what Khamenei himself would do. But certainly the others, other members of the establishment, I mean, a lot of them have family abroad already. So it wouldn't be such a great leap of faith for them to follow their family abroad. And, this idea that members of the elite might eventually sort of find themselves in Moscow is not unrealistic. I mean, there is that would be one of the options ahead of them. Not an attractive option, it has to be said, but it's an option ahead of them. Khamenei himself, I think, is quite different. I mean, I get the impression that Khamenei isn't, he hasn't left the country, I think, since 1988 or something. I mean, he's not a great traveller. And at his age and everything, I'm not sure he's going to be upping and sticks and going.
Thank you very much, Ali Ansari, who's Professor in Modern History with reference to the Middle East at the University of St Andrews. We're now joined by the former UK Ambassador to Iran, Sir Richard Dalton. Welcome, Sir Richard. Thank you for joining me. Can you explain to me what we should expect might happen if these protests really do get out of hand? Because a lot of the time there's an expectation in the West that if a regime they don't like falls, what comes after it will be more amenable to a Western outlook, and then there's continual disappointment. So can you explain what you think these protests really mean, both diplomatically and politically?
There are so many options that it's extremely hard to pin down one and say that is going to be the likely course of action. It's a country of 85 million people, vast as most of Western Europe, with diverse communities, just over half Persian speaking, but other communities speaking Arabic or Turkish-related languages, or with links into Pakistan in the south east of the country. So many variables. For example, if significant numbers of the security forces were to defect and to stop trying to stop these protests, there might indeed be a civil war of some kind. That's at one end. On the other, the people around Khomeini could decide that the time has come to retire the old man, and we could get a new supreme leader backed up by some form of military junta to try and continue the Islamic Republic by an alternative but very similar leadership. Then, of course, a lot of people, the majority in Iran, want to see a democratic transition, want to see consultation of the people as to what kind of future they should have, perhaps through a referendum. But there's no political organization in the country behind a democratic transition. And the conditions are very poor for an alternative leadership with a liberal vision to emerge. So sadly, the idea of a peaceful democratic transition is currently low if you stack up these options by likelihood.
Let me just have one other question, which is to ask about Donald Trump. He threatened to intervene if Iranian forces started to fire on protesters. Again, it wasn't obvious what that meant. What even that threat, let alone what the action might be, what will even that threat, the impact of even that threat be? Both, did you see it, I suppose, as a former diplomat, as a helpful intervention or not?
No, I don't see it as a helpful intervention, because the Iranians want to sort out their own future by themselves. There will be a minority who see it as helpful, who want moral support from America and feel that in previous rounds of protest, the Americans have been lukewarm. So this saber rattling by Trump will be welcomed by some. But the fact is, Trump is not going to occupy Iran. He's not going to try and rule Iran. He might try some kind of decapitation, quick in, quick out operation. But as with Venezuela, that may not change the regime at all. And there are now far fewer levers for the United States or any outsiders to influence what happens in Iran than the Americans have with a small country like Venezuela that is just on their doorstep and has a capital city 10 miles from the coast, off which sits about 1/4 of the entire American Navy.
Wow.
The situation in Iran is not like that, and the opportunity that exists to use their military might is not going to go away. But I don't think the Americans in the short term are going to be a decisive factor.
Sir Richard Dalton, former British ambassador to Iran, thank you so much for joining me. I'm sure that's not the last time we'll be visiting that story.